Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of My Nostalgia Trip Games. This time we'll be taking a look at the first 5 games for the Sega Megadrive, or as it's called in North America, Sega Genesis. I don't yet have any fancy cables for this, nor do I have an SD card reader, so we're gonna have to go all the way old school with this. So let's get on with it. To my recollection, only one of my friends in our area had a Sega Megadrive, at least only one that I knew of. The said Megadrive, along with a pile of games, was often borrowed to some of my other friends, so I got to play those games often enough. One of the first games that caught my eye was Outrun 2019, because, hey, it says Outrun. On paper, it's a good idea, taking a much-loved racing game into a futuristic setting, but thematically is as far from Outrun as you can imagine, which makes a huge difference. Now though, it only adds to the nostalgia that the game title has the year we're currently living in, but oddly enough, it's not the dystopian sci-fi setting you usually get for these kinds of futuristically fueled games. Really, the only futuristic thing here is the car, which isn't even that far off, considering the current generation of supercars or hypercars even. Of course, gone are the two young lovers seen in the cabriolet Ferrari of the original Outrun, which is another step away from the original mood of Outrun. But all this is explained in the fact that Outrun 2019 was developed originally as Cyber Road for the Sega CD before the project was renamed as Junkers High when the development was moved to the Megadrive. I suppose the final title was just a marketing ploy. Nevertheless, Outrun 2019 is a fairly enjoyable game for what it is, as long as you don't pay attention to its name. The obvious introductory game to any Sega console is Sonic the Hedgehog. You can't really escape it even if you wanted to. Sega! My first thought seeing a Sonic game was, this is supposedly the rival to Super Mario Bros. I wonder what the fuss is all about. Well, the game is fast. And I do mean it's damn fast. When you've reached the highest possible speed Sonic is able to move at, you can hardly react to anything that's coming at you. But there's the thing. Sonic the Hedgehog needs to be played in a completely different manner to all the Mario-like platformers. Even the basics of platforming are tweaked a bit in the Sonic series. The Hedgehog doesn't run at 2 distinctly different speeds like Mario does, but instead he slowly accelerates to the maximum on foot, and then you get the rolling movement, which can get quite a bit faster than just running. As usual though, the faster you go, the higher and longer you will jump. All the levels in the game feature lots of enemies and spikes and other obstacles you can easily get killed by, which makes the speedier movement extremely hazardous if you have no idea about the level layouts. So it's more or less memorizing and trial and error all throughout the game, with relatively little room for natural flow of platforming. There are also some small puzzles you need to solve in order to get through levels, which makes Sonic a much more demanding platforming game, and a series, than most of its kind. Having said all that, the Sonic series is still classic Sega stuff for good reasons. It was wildly different than its competitors. It had great graphics and soundtrack, it was very playable, despite everything, and it was charming in a new way. One more thing I could add here, that I only recently found out myself. The bonus game you access by jumping into the big ring at the end of each level after you've collected enough rings is heavily based on Taito's lesser-known 1989 arcade game called Cameltry, which itself was never released on a Sega console, but you can find the game on the Super Nintendo as On the Ball in Europe and North America. Check that out if you enjoy getting confused in a constantly rolling maze. Disney produced a lot of great action platforms for the Sega consoles, and being a fan of Disney cartoons, I was very eager to play QuackShot when I saw it in my friend's collection, because it seemed to combine two of my favorite pop culture things back then, Disney cartoons and Indiana Jones. At this point though, I had no knowledge of the existence of DuckTales or other such masterpieces on the NES, so QuackShot was basically my introduction to Disney platforming adventure games. To be honest, I can't remember all that much from my first attempt at playing the game, but I do remember it being an intriguing game, which would have needed some more time put into it. So, obviously, most of my experience of the game was gained through emulation, and eventually after buying my own copy of it included in the Disney collection, in which the game is coupled with the Castle of Illusion, another great Disney platformer. QuackShot is a surprisingly long and complex game. The surprise comes in the form of a need to travel between different locations at least once or twice per level, and the complexity comes in the form of different weapons and items you get to pick up and carry in your inventory, and eventually use them to make progress in your quest. The basic plotline is to find a lost treasure, so we're basically talking about a DuckTales themed game without Uncle Scrooge heading it. It's an interesting alternative to the arguably more famous Mickey Mouse games on Sega and DuckTales, etc. on the NES, and it's a nice challenge, a fair candidate for any Sega nostalgia trip. I bought my very own Megadrive, the very same Model 2 I'm playing all these games for this video on, in 2002 or 3, and I got a nice bundle of games along with it. One of them was the obvious aforementioned Sonic the Hedgehog, and one of them I shall save until the last in this episode, and another one was a fairly common 3-in-1 cartridge called Megagames I. So because of this episode will have 7 games instead of 5. Oh well. The first game, Super Hang-On, is a sequel to Sega's original motorcycle racing game, Hang-On. This one tweaks the concept of the original by adding elements from Outrun, namely a choosable soundtrack and a route you can race through. This time though, instead of one large area split into 5 different routes and their variations, you have 4 continents to choose from, each representing a different difficulty level and having different numbers of checkpoints. The widely varying backgrounds and 2 game modes make Super Hang-On the Megadrive a good game to return to every now and then. On a side note, the series also featured a spin-off game called Enduro Racer, which took you off-roading. More about that later on. The second game, Columns, is a Tetris variant in which you drop columns of 3 jewels in a pit and try to arrange them into series of 3 or more. This is easily my most played game in Megagames I, but then again I'm a sucker for all sorts of Tetris variants. The pseudo-classical Greek-styled music in the game by Tokuhiko Wabo has become legendary by its own, and I'd say it's because the music and graphics go together very well. The third and final game, World Cup Italia 1990, is pretty obviously a football game, and not a particularly interesting one at that. But I can't really say because I avoid football games in general. I've tried it a few times, but I just can't get a feel for the controls in this one. Obviously, it holds no nostalgic value to me whatsoever, but apart from World Cup Italia 90, Megagames I is still worth having and playing every once in a while, unless you'd rather have all the games on separate cartridges, which is just more expensive. The last game included in my initial Megadrive set was Streets of Rage, or Bare Knuckle as it's known in Japan. Here's another great street brawler type game that you can play with your friend, and it has all the elements that makes a classic brawler game. A good amount of moves you can perform, melee weapons to pick up and utilize, energy bonuses, well-constructed boss fights, and a critically acclaimed soundtrack, which was considered ahead of its time, featuring elements of various types of electronic music at the time, such as house, techno, jungle, breakbeat, etc. The most fun thing about Streets of Rage, though, is that if you press a certain button when playing, you will summon a police car to the scene from which a police person will emerge and shoot a special shot from a special sort of a bazooka, which will then hit all the enemies on the screen you're at. Highly entertaining to watch and puts a nice emphasis on the game's non-Japanese title. These kinds of games are not really good for single-player gaming, but in this particular case I can easily enjoy a session by myself, mostly because of the music and that special fun thing I described. That said, it is still better with a friend.